picture the sheer ontological shock of the early 1600s. I mean, for centuries, humanity had this fixed, really comfortable understanding of its place in the cosmos.
Right, the universe made sense. There was an order to things.
Exactly. But suddenly, the scientific revolution starts just tearing that certainty apart. You've got Galileo pointing his telescope at the stars, proving the Earth isn't the center of everything.
Which is terrifying for people at the time.
Oh, completely. And then you have these early microscopes revealing, like, invisible worlds of teeming life in just a single drop of water. So the sheer scale of reality is expanding in both directions, the macro and the micro, and, well, none of it seems to align neatly with traditional theology.
No, it doesn't. And you have to combine that intellectual vertigo with actual physical devastation. I mean, Europe is in the grip of the 30 Years' War.
Right, it's just chaos.
Complete chaos. Factions are literally burning each other at the stake over microscopic theological differences. Theologians are essentially arguing with cannons and swords. You were forced to choose a side, the rigid, militant dogma of the past or the cold, mechanical reality of the new empirical science.
And right in the middle of this madness, a young doctor living in a quiet English town sits down in his study. He doesn't write a manifesto. He doesn't write a scientific treatise. He writes a deeply intimate private journal trying to figure out how to harmonize his cutting-edge medical training with his personal faith.
Which is exactly what we're looking at today.
Yes. Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is to explore that exact tension. We are taking a deep dive into a text called Religio Medici, The Religion of a Doctor, written around 1635 by Sir Thomas Browne, and we've gathered a fascinating stack of sources for this, including excerpts from the authorized 1643 edition of the text, historical analyses of 17th century medical education, and modern literary critiques.
And what becomes immediately clear from diving into these sources is that Religio Medici is not, it's not a systematic theological textbook.
No, not at all.
It doesn't offer these bulletproof dogmatic arguments. It's an inner monologue. It's a philosophical self-examination that was originally meant as a private meditation. I mean, Browne never even intended for it to be published.
Which is wild, because the story of how it did reach the public is almost as fascinating as the text itself.
Yeah.
To understand the impact of the book, we really have to look at Browne's background. Like, he wasn't just some isolated country philosopher.
No, definitely not. He was an incredibly illustrious physician and antiquarian. He studied at the absolute epicenters of the new empirical science: Oxford, Montpellier in France, Padua in Italy, and Leiden in the Netherlands.
And those locations are super important.
They're the key to his entire worldview. Padua and Leiden were the vanguard of the medical revolution. This is the era where the strict reliance on ancient texts, like, the writings of Galen, was finally being replaced by actual physical observation.
They were actually cutting things open.
Yes. Browne was exposed to the absolute frontier of anatomical knowledge. He was a man of the dissecting theater and the laboratory. He was trained to trust empirical evidence over inherited authority.
So he takes all that rigorous training back to the quiet town of Norwich, and before he's even 30, he writes this text as a, what does he call it? A private exercise directed to myself.
A memorandum for his own use, yeah.
Right. And he shares the manuscript with a few close friends. But then, in 1642, a London publisher named Andrew Crooke gets his hands on a copy and prints a pirated, highly corrupted edition.
It's essentially a massive 17th century digital leak.
Exactly. It's like finding the private philosophical diary of a top modern neurosurgeon. You expect cold, hard facts, but instead you get this beautiful, vulnerable exploration of the soul.
And the public reaction was explosive. I mean, Browne was horrified because the pirated text was full of errors. It forced him to release an authorized, corrected version in 1643 just to set the record straight.
But even with the corrected version, his contemporaries still lost their minds over it, didn't they?
Oh, totally. Figures like Alexander Ross, who was a staunch defender of classical Aristotelian philosophy, and Sir Kenelm Digby, who was this cavalier and natural philosopher, they attacked Browne relentlessly.
Digby actually wrote his critique in a single day while locked in a prison cell, which is just incredible dedication to being a hater.
It really is.
But looking at the critiques in our sources, the hostility seems kind of disproportionate. I mean, if he was a scientist, Why was the public and why were these specific critics so immediately suspicious of a doctor writing about religion? Weren't physicians historically quite religious?
They were, but the 17th century brought a radical shift in perception. There was this popular, deeply ingrained prejudice at the time, summarized by the phrase ubi tres medici duo aethei, where there are three doctors, there are two atheists.
Wow, that's a pretty harsh stereotype.
It was, and the suspicion was rooted in the new scientific method. Physicians spent all their time studying the physical mechanics of nature. Philosophers categorized these mechanics as second causes.
Second causes, what does that mean exactly?
It's the literal physical chain of events, like a muscle pulling a bone or blood pumping through a valve, the mechanical how of nature.
Ah, okay. And the fear was that if you spend your entire life obsessing over the gears of the machine, you eventually forget about the clockmaker.
Precisely. The public assumed that studying these second causes made doctors blind to the first cause, which is God. They thought that staring at organs and tissues all day naturally led to the conclusion that the universe was just a soulless material machine.
So the title itself, Religio Medici, was a deliberate provocation. He's pushing back against the stereotype, arguing that a man of the laboratory can still possess a soul.
That was exactly his goal.
But if that was his goal, why did critics like Ross and Digby attack him for it? Weren't they on the side of religion too?
They were, but they fundamentally misunderstood the genre of his writing. You see, Ross and Digby were looking for a dogmatic treatise. Ross, being an Aristotelian, wanted strict, rigid categories of thought.
He wanted a textbook.
Right, so when they read Browne's intimate, fluid, poetic exploration of his private doubts and ecstasies, they evaluated it as if it were a rigid theological argument. They constantly questioned his orthodoxy because they just couldn't fathom a mind that refused to lock itself into one single ideological box.
And our sources highlight how Browne managed to hold these competing worldviews, empirical science and deep faith in his mind simultaneously. He does this by creating a highly specific kind of firewall between the two.
He really does. In the realm of science, he's a total skeptic.
Yeah, he constantly doubts, demands empirical evidence, and completely refuses to be a slave to ancient authority. But then, in theology, he claims he follows the great wheel of the church.
He draws a very sharp distinction between the two domains. He writes, "To believe only possibilities is not faith, but mere philosophy."
So wait, does this mean he just turns off his critical thinking brain the moment he walks into a church?
What's fascinating here is that he doesn't turn off his brain at all. The firewall isn't there to keep the two domains from interacting. It's there to establish their sequence. Browne recognizes the absolute limits of human reason.
Okay, so he pushes the science as far as it can go.
Exactly. He pushes his scientific critical thinking to the absolute limit in the laboratory. But when the scientific method hits the boundary of the unexplainable, when reason is exhausted by the sheer complexity of the universe, he doesn't retreat. He embraces what we might call a mysticism of the experimental.
I love that phrase. So the experiment itself is the launch pad. He observes, like, the mechanics of a beetle under a microscope, understands the second causes, but the sheer intricacy of it forces his mind into a state of wonder.
Yes, he loves to lose his reason in a mystery, to bring his mind to an o altitudo, a peak of ecstatic wonder. And he grounds this in a theological concept known as the two books.
The two books, right? This is crucial.
Browne believes that God authored two distinct texts. The first is the written book of God, Scripture, but the second is the book of nature. He views the visible physical world as a public and universal manuscript.
Which completely reframes the act of scientific investigation. The plants, the anatomies, the stars, they aren't dead, inert matter. They are literally text.
Browne believed that nature is filled with hieroglyphs and stenography-like, a spiritual shorthand. Every physical object, every biological system is a visible sign pointing toward an invisible divine reality.
Wow. So the scientist isn't turning away from God by studying nature. The scientist is actively reading God's second book.
Exactly. It turns the atheistic doctor stereotype entirely on its head. He's suggesting that the traditional theologians only have one book, while the scientifically literate physician actually has access to two.
And this ability to read multiple layers of truth in nature deeply influenced his approach to other human beings, which, here's where it gets really interesting, leads to an attitude that was shockingly rare for his time.
Against the backdrop of the 30 Years' War, where religious factions are literally slaughtering each other over communion practices, Browne emerges as this radical voice of tolerance.
Right. I mean, he was a devout Anglican belonging to what he called that Reformed New Caste religion. Yet he possessed a vast universal charity that was highly suspicious to his contemporaries.
He flatly refused to engage in the bitter religious polemics of his day. He explicitly wrote that he could not hate or pity Turks, infidels, or Jews simply for their beliefs.
A stance that could easily get you branded a heretic in the 1600s. It's this peaceful live and let live attitude. But wait, is it possible his tolerance was just a byproduct of secular indifference? Like, a modern reader might look at him and say, well, he's a scientist. He just didn't care enough about theological minutiae to fight over it.
His critics certainly suspected that, but his tolerance actually stemmed from deep humility, not indifference.
Humility.
Yes. Because he believed the divine truth that O Altitudo was so vast and incomprehensible, he felt it was the height of arrogance for any single human faction to claim they possess the complete picture. You can't truly understand the overwhelming complexity of the universe and then turn around and burn someone at the stake over a slight doctrinal difference.
That makes perfect sense. He valued the reason and balance of the Anglican Church over fanaticism. And his tolerance wasn't just abstract. It extended to the bitterest rivals of his own Anglican Church, the Catholics.
Which was a massive deal back then.
Oh, yeah. The strict Puritans of his era wanted to strip the Church of all imagery, all physical ritual. They refused to kneel, wanting religion to be entirely an intellectual, abstract exercise. But Browne was remarkably tolerant of Catholic practices, like using holy water or crucifixes.
And this is where his medical background directly informs his theology again. Browne didn't view human beings as ghosts trapped in biological machines. He understood the profound physiological link between the body and the spirit.
Because 17th century medicine involved the study of the humors and the nervous system, right? Emphasizing how physical states alter internal realities.
Exactly. So when the Puritans say, faith is only in the mind, don't kneel, Browne the physician steps in and says, no, you have a musculoskeletal system. If you put your physical body into a posture of humility, your internal spiritual disposition will actually follow.
He's arguing for the unity of the human being, body and spirit.
Mm-hmm.
That sensible actions and physical postures actually help promote invisible devotion.
You cannot separate the physical action from the spiritual state.
And this profound respect for the human body brings us to one of the most compelling concepts in Religio Medici. The idea of man as a microcosm.
This is one of my favorite parts of his philosophy.
Me too. Now, you listening are probably familiar with the classical great chain of being. We all know the standard hierarchy. You start with inanimate dirt, move up to the vegetative life of plants, the sensitive life of animals, then humans, and finally the pure spiritual life of angels.
Normally, humanity is just viewed as a single rung stuck in the middle of that ladder.
Right. But Browne takes that conventional hierarchy and completely collapses it into a single organism. He writes, whilst I study to find how I am a microcosm, or little world, I find myself in some way to exceed the great.
He's saying we aren't just one rung on the ladder, we are the entire ladder.
It's like we are biological matryoshka dolls. We've got the dude, the plants, the animals, and the stars all nested inside us, capped off with a piece of the divine.
That is a brilliant analogy. And it matters because it gives humanity a unique, elevated status. We contain the mineral makeup of the earth in our bones. We possess the vegetative life of plants in our cellular growth. We experience the sensitive life of animals through our nervous system. And we hold the rational, divine spark of the angels in our consciousness.
Humanity is the ultimate synthesis of the entire cosmos.
Exactly. And this elevated status leads Browne to completely invert how we usually think about art and nature. We traditionally think of art as an imitation of nature, like a painting trying to capture the beauty of a real sunset. But Browne famously defined their relationship by stating, art is the perfection of nature.
So he's saying nature is just the rough draft.
He views nature as the ectype, the physical copy or manifestation. God is the original architect, the ultimate artist. Therefore, the complex anatomy of the human body isn't just biology. It is a masterpiece of divine art.
So when Browne performs a medical dissection, he isn't just cutting into meat.
No, not at all. He is studying the ultimate canvas of God's art. Every surgery, every anatomical study is essentially an act of art criticism, studying the brushstrokes of the divine.
That changes the entire stakes of his medical practice.
Yeah.
And this unique, incredibly layered way of looking at the world didn't just create a profound theological statement. Our sources emphasize that Browne accidentally birthed a whole new style of literature.
His writing style is an exact mirror of his philosophy. It's complex, layered, and deeply personal. Centuries after his death, modern readers and romantic writers like Charles Lamb, Thomas de Quincey, and especially Samuel Taylor Coleridge rediscovered Religio Medici.
And they didn't read it as a rigid theological treatise, which was the mistake his contemporaries made.
Exactly. They recognized it as a work of literary genius. Coleridge praised the book specifically for being dramatic and not metaphysical. It's not a dry mathematical proof. It's the gentle exhibition of a human personality. All his passion, his fears, his doubts poured onto the page.
Coleridge called him a generous and noble visionary.
He did, and the prose itself reflects this. Browne utilizes a style known as a cento, which is essentially a patchwork composition, like a literary mosaic. He weaves together references to ancient texts, complex medical terminology, hermetic philosophy, and personal anecdotes into this seamless tapestry.
So what does this all mean for us? Well, he's essentially writing a modern blog post or personal essay, centuries before those formats even existed. He was the friend who reads absolutely everything and connects it all together.
He really is the father of the modern personal essay, a masterful example of the art of structured digression. And that is precisely why Religio Medici remains so vital for you to read today. Think about how Browne's work sits directly at the crossroads of the scientific revolution and personal spirituality.
Right.
That is the exact tension we are trying to navigate in our modern technology-driven world. I mean, we are saturated with data. We have more empirical understanding of those second causes than any generation in human history.
Oh, for sure. We've mapped the human genome. We've seen the edge of the observable universe. We carry supercomputers in our pockets.
But the question brain forces us to ask is, in all our mapping of the mechanics, are we losing our sense of the first cause? Can we still find room for the O altitudo, that peak of ecstatic wonder, in an age dominated by algorithms and artificial intelligence?
It's a question we desperately need to answer.
Browne stands as historical proof that scientific literacy and profound spiritual depth are not mutually exclusive. They can, and really should, feed each other.
That is the perfect distillation of his legacy. So let's recap the journey we've been on through these sources. We've explored the brilliant private mind of a 17th century physician who completely refused to choose between the laboratory and the altar. A man who looked at the violence and fanaticism of his era and responded with radical tolerance, rooted in the humility of knowing the universe is too vast for human arrogance.
A scientist who looked into the anatomy of the human body and saw a microcosm, a perfect biological synthesis of the entire cosmos, carrying a spark of the divine.
He demonstrated that the pursuit of scientific knowledge is an act of profound devotion, literally reading the second book of God. And in doing so, he left behind a literary masterpiece that perfectly captures the complex, beautiful, and sometimes contradictory nature of the human mind.
But before we wrap up today, we want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've talked extensively about Browne's belief that the natural world is a public manuscript, right? A text written in divine hieroglyphs and secret stenography.
Yes, the idea that every physical object around us is a signpost pointing to an invisible spiritual reality.
So consider the environment outside your own window today. The specific shape of the trees, the changing weather patterns, the architecture of your city, the animals you encounter.
Yeah.
If the physical world is indeed a book written in a secret spiritual shorthand, what is that environment trying to tell you today? Are you simply looking at the world as a collection of dead mechanical parts? Or are you actually reading it?
Oh, that's such a great question to end on. Think about that the next time you find yourself stuck between the cold, hard facts of modern life and the murky, unexplainable mysteries of your own experience. Remember the small-town doctor in his study, mapping the path to heaven on the back of a medical chart. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning, keep reading, and keep exploring.